Well, thanks, Andrea, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you that ending poverty is not science fiction anymore. It's happening in a community near you, and it's really thrilling. So I'm very grateful to have been invited to come and speak to you a little bit today about our work and how I think it fits into the context of things that are happening in Alberta and in Canada and with other cities, and grateful to have shared the podium with an extraordinary leader like Deputy Premier Matthews. I think that was inspiring and it's instructive. So let's thank her again for her leadership. And I can't help but note that she mentioned that there's a desire to seek unlikely partnerships and a $50 million fund. So can we apply? So we don't have that fund in Alberta yet, but you never know. Things seem to be changing in Alberta. When we flip over a table in Alberta, we really flip it over. Now, one of the things I really like about the work that I do in local government is you have to be incredibly creative and you have to be incredibly collaborative, because we're the order of government that means the most to people in their day-to-day lives. If we stop doing our work, people notice almost immediately, and I get tweeted about it almost immediately. It's not that the work of provincial and federal governments isn't important as well, but as Mayor Nenshi says, they could shut down for a few days before you'd notice, but if the local government shuts down, you'll notice in the same minute virtually. And so we have to be creative, not only because we're close to people, but also because we have such limited resources. And I'll touch on that a little bit later and why I think it causes us to have to behave a little bit differently. We also, I think, can be more collaborative because by and large across this country, local governments are nonpartisan. And I understand the importance and value of partisanship at the provincial and federal level, but I also really value not having that layer of complexity to deal with at the municipal issue. It allows us to be very solutions focused and to move beyond ideology. And I think that's where you build bridges to be able to get broad community buy-in, which is, as the Deputy Premier talked about, has to be the foundation for this work, is real community change and real community buy-in. And so even though federal governments and provincial governments control most of the levers, it still has been the responsibility, and I think this movement has really been built neighborhood by neighborhood and community by community across this country by many of you who are in this room, who I'd add my thanks for your efforts, your tireless leadership and advocacy for marginalized people. It is paying off. It is making a difference. It is changing the narrative in this country, and we see it in all kinds of different indicators, from elections to the fact that business leaders are now talking about this like it's something that's achievable and something that's desirable, something they would see benefit in as citizens and as business leaders. And again, that's what cities are really good at doing, is building big tents. And that's what we've been focused on doing at the City of Edmonton with our poverty strategy. And as Stephen Huddard noted, the benefits are massive. And as the Deputy Premier alluded to, the benefits are huge, whether your perspective is that of a taxpayer or an interested citizen or a business person or a policymaker. And we can all understand the benefits of saving money in healthcare. And if we care in this country about preserving public and universal health care, then we should all care about poverty elimination, because it's the best strategy we have to protect public health care, which I think is a key competitive advantage for this country. But it goes beyond that into policing and into justice and into incarceration, which we're also wasting billions and billions of dollars on in this country. In Alberta alone, the estimate is $7 billion is the opportunity cost of poverty. That's exactly how much money the provincial government is missing because of oil revenue right now. So we can take a short-term strategy to try to hack and slash the budget and pull some revenue levers, which we clearly need to do in Alberta. We had a big election about that. And only one party said we can't raise taxes. Everybody else was arguing about which are the right taxes to raise to make sure we have enough money to get off the roller coaster ride of resource dependence in our public treasury. And so the question is, which ones are we going to raise? And that's important. But how are we going to, on an intergenerational basis, ensure the sustainability of all of these public services and ensure that we're actually spending the resources increasingly on prevention? The only problem is the ROI isn't 4 years from now, and it isn't next quarter. It's a generation from now. But again, this is where cities are really exciting, is that more and more you're seeing leadership at cities, and I don't attribute this to myself, it's really my city council that's willing to do this, is to think intergenerationally about the city building that we're doing, not to think about the next election. And my philosophy is I'd rather do the right thing and lose the next election than do the wrong thing and have to live with the consequences. I don't think that would be fun. And for a municipality, we do have a direct stake in this. I do get the question sometimes, well, why is this really our responsibility, or why are we talking about this? And our single largest expenditure, our healthcare, if you will, the thing that is growing unsustainably, the thing that's out of control, is our policing cost. And that has more to do with poverty and homelessness and social disorder and historical trauma than it has to do with anything else. And so it's on the doorstep of municipalities to pick up the pieces for the other work that isn't happening, but is starting to happen. And so we do have a fiscal interest as a municipality in the success of this work in our largest area of expenditure, which is policing. But we also have an interest because housing tends to fall through the cracks. It's something that we play a role in, even if we're not the principal funder of social housing. We're still sort of the stewards of huge elements of what happens in housing in this country, in our communities. And one of the ways that we can ensure that the existing supply, if we can act to preserve that, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but that existing supply of social housing is actually going to the people who need it, rather than people who are locked in cycles of intergenerational poverty, who could be lifted out of it with living wages, with better mobility, with access to skills, with child care to be enabled to earn more. Whatever the solution is to cover off the barrier that a particular family is facing, that will allow them to earn enough and participate in the regular housing market along with everybody else. That's a much more efficient way to deal with housing than massive social housing schemes, which we've seen the result of those is that 30 years later everyone wants out. And that's a challenge we're having with the federal government right now, is the expiring agreements tied to 600,000 units with mortgages expiring over the coming years. And this is something FCM's been really strong, and I'll come back to that. But the societal benefits in the public purse, I mentioned $7 billion in Alberta alone, but there are, whether you think about that from the perspective of a taxpayer or a business paying taxes, there are also specific benefits to business. Reduce social disorder. I hear from business owners all the time in the tougher parts of our city and in our downtown that it makes it hard for them to recruit people to want to work with them. It makes it hard for them to entertain clients when there are people in distress on the streets. And they would like me to do something about that. And usually they're not asking me to put them in jail. They're asking our community thoughtfully to try to take some action to improve the situation of those people, recognizing that it will be good for their business, but that it will also be good for that individual. Because I think we're mostly moral creatures. I think that's how we've managed not to kill each other over the last several million years. I mean, we care about each other. We're compassionate beings. But social disorder is a real issue in our large cities, and I think that there are absolute demonstrable benefits to business of addressing that. Greater participation in the labor market. I think this is something we need to continue to emphasize, and particularly in Alberta, where we have challenges with labor supply when things are growing. Increased participation is a good thing. It's helpful for the economy, and there's real benefit to it. And we see employers increasingly turning to programs that lift underprivileged people into advantage and give them skills and employ them. And by the way, they see huge benefits in terms of what it means for their workplace to be more inclusive, and a sense of corporate social responsibility out of it as well. I think the really exciting opportunities are around entrepreneurship, though. How can we empower the next unlikely set of entrepreneurs who actually know what the problems are and how to solve problems for people living on the margins? And so that's an area that we're starting to do some work on, where I think there's really exciting potential, and where there's opportunities for mentorship, opportunities for connection from the existing business community to the future unexpected business community that can arise out of these initiatives. And then finally, if people are earning more and have a more stable economic situation, they're going to spend more money in your local economy. And that's just useful for everyone, and governments tax that, and that produces more revenue, and so it'll all work out. Trust me. But more importantly, if we achieve these ends, we'll have dignity for all. And so if you need the business case, I've given you the business case. But if you're in this room, you don't need the business case. You know that this is the right thing to do. And a really exciting thing that we found, and I'll give you some numbers for this a little bit later on, is that Edmontonians know it's the right thing to do too. I wasn't sure, but now I am. But this is the most Canadian thing to do. These are Canadian values. This is absolutely, I think, how we see ourselves. It's not how we've acted, but it's how we see ourselves as caring and inclusive people who want everyone to succeed. We haven't acted this way yet, but we're getting our act together. And I want to challenge your preconceptions, if last night didn't challenge them enough, that Albertans, that this is a very Albertan thing to do as well. And you have to actually reach deep into Alberta history to see some of this. You have to reach back to the dirty 30s when the province was the poorest place in Confederation, before we found all the hydrocarbons. And like many rural communities that struggled through that time, it was the strength of community and fellowship and support that allowed families to survive and build. And that sense of community is still there. And so many people on the prairies are still only 1 or 2 generations off the farm, that's still part of the cultural DNA of the place. That people, if they haven't been a part of it, don't necessarily understand about the prairies. It was a lot of that same sentiment that gave rise to Tommy Douglas, for example. It's not that different. Actually, at one time, Alberta and Saskatchewan were going to be the same province. History would have been completely different if that had happened. Can you imagine if Saskatchewan had had all the hydrocarbons? So it's absolutely an Edmonton thing to do. Absolutely an Edmonton thing to do. We are a caring and inclusive community, and I think one of the phrases that I look back to on this that I think has weaved its way through the city and its whole history is something that the first president of the University of Alberta said, which is that the university will not be, and I'm paraphrasing this part, not be just a preserve for the elite, not just an ivory tower, as it were, but it will be an institution for the uplifting of the whole people. This was the first act of the Alberta legislature, was to found the university, and the first president was hired to make it something that would be relevant to everybody, not something that would be relevant only to a few. And so I've been challenging myself to think for a while now about what it would mean to build a city that was for the uplifting of all people. I think it's an inspiring idea. I think we've been trying to do it anyway without putting the right language to it. But I think when we talk about inclusion, which is a word that, it's like sustainability, you say it enough times and anyone can say it without knowing the significance of it. And so I really think about Edmonton as a city that is for the uplifting of the whole people. And so last spring, after talking to my city council colleagues about it, we created a poverty elimination task force. And we were very deliberate in framing it as a poverty elimination task force because we had had an experience about 5 years earlier. We actually did it the opposite order from Ontario. We are 5 years into our 10-year plan to end homelessness. So that was transformational for Edmonton and for Calgary and for Alberta to set that goal, to move from managing it to ending it. That was transformational. And we made great progress. We've housed 3,000 people, and we've got an over 80% to high 80% success rate at keeping them housed. So housing first absolutely works, and you're going to save a ton of money. So that's been successful, but it also has challenged us in 2 ways. One, 2,000 more people became homeless, so 3,000 steps forward, 2,000 steps back. And the last pillar of the 10-year plan to end homelessness is that we have to start, if we're serious about prevention, we have to start talking about poverty. And so I took a look at this and said, okay, we're at the halfway point, kind of a watershed moment in this 10-year plan to end homelessness. I guess we have to start talking about poverty now. And I was a little afraid at first. I said, we've been talking about poverty reduction, poverty amelioration, poverty mitigation. And we were really mincing our words because we weren't sure if our community was ready to start talking about ending poverty. But with Council's unanimous support, we took a bold position, and based on what we had learned about the transformative effect of setting an ambitious and definitive goal, we set about to end poverty in Edmonton. Now, we gave ourselves lots of time. We said we want to do it over a generation because we recognize that the scale and complexity of it may take that long, but that we need to act now if we want things to be better a generation from now. And so we have an extraordinary group of people who I serve on this task force with, including the Anglican Bishop of Edmonton, who's here, Jane Alexander. Just stand up so they can recognize you. You'll get a chance to meet her later. And 20 other people, some of whom are here today, from across a swath of the business community, the faith communities, social service sector, health professionals, academic leaders, and representatives from the government of Alberta who we want to align this work with. And our vision is to come up with a 10-year plan to move us towards. What are the next 10 years worth of work we need to do in order to eliminate poverty in a generation? And we struck very deliberately 2 roundtables to support us, because not everyone at the task force itself is an expert, though we do have phenomenal expertise at the table. And so the 2 roundtables we set up, and this was very deliberate. One was an Aboriginal roundtable, so that we could learn from the lived experience and the wisdom and the cultural understanding of poverty from Indigenous people in our community. And that's been invaluable, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that's so important. And we set up an information and research roundtable, and benefiting from the wealth of knowledge in public service and in academia and in the agencies themselves in our city, we assembled this information and research roundtable. Really helped us work through some of the very, very difficult work. And so we've achieved a couple of milestones already, though this is still a work in progress. The first was establishing some principles, and I don't want to run through all of them because you can find them in the material that we have available on our website, and I'm sure some material here. But the most important one was that, besides obviously that this is systemic change, and we talk about that in a bunch of different ways, the most important one was that for this work to be meaningful, it had to be informed by the lived experience of people living in poverty. And we challenged ourselves to start thinking about what all those lived experiences were, because we all had our own set of generalizations about them, which only captured a narrow slice of it. And with 100,000 people in our city living in poverty according to an economic measure, a pure economic measure, the real answer is 100,000 different lived experiences of poverty in our city. Now we can draw some conclusions and make some reasonable generalizations from it based on data, but we also need to hear from those people. And where we've done that, that's been some of the most transformative and powerful part of the work for the task force. And we're going to have to actually figure out how to bottle that up and share it with our community, so that the community broadly can have that same call to action, that same heartstring tug that our task force has had over and over and over again. And we defined poverty very deliberately to be more than just an economic measure. And so our definition, I'll read it out, is that Edmontonians experience poverty when they lack or are denied economic, social, and cultural resources to have a quality of life that sustains and facilitates full and meaningful participation in the community. And you really have to parse that. You have to read it 2 or 3 times to really see all of the layers to it. But most importantly, it's not only about money. It's about dignity, it's about participation, it's about being valued, it's about having systemic barriers removed, it's about addressing deliberate barriers that are put in place for people. So that was a big milestone for us to come to that understanding. And again, our Aboriginal roundtable was very, very helpful in broadening our definition. The Cree word, and Cree is not the only language, but it's the traditional language of the area right where Edmonton is. The Cree word for poverty makes no reference to money. It's about deprivation in a much broader sense. Deprivation of community, deprivation of connections. And we've really taken that to heart in our understanding. This is much more holistic than just money, as important as the economics of this work is. And then we've also, the next milestone we achieved was establishing a baseline. Obviously, if you're going to try to fix something, you got to figure out where you stand right now. And so more than just measuring it, we worked with the Edmonton Social Planning Council to build a poverty profile. I see there's a printed copy out there. Again, it's available on the website. And they did a masterful job of capturing the length and breadth, depth, and complexity of the experience of poverty, including lived experience of poverty in our city. And so that was a very important milestone with us that shaped our thinking. So our next step, based on everything we'd learned, was to identify the focal areas where we thought we needed to have conversation with experts in the community. And initially we identified 6, and then we added a 7th because it was an iterative process, and I'm glad that we did add that one. So the 7 we ultimately came to were economic security, because you can't not talk about that. Early childhood development, because we have to do that. Education, because we also have to do that. Community well-being, because we have to think holistically about this. Health and wellness, because that's the big payoff, but it's also a huge barrier for a lot of people. Justice and democratic participation, because that's essential to social change, and it's essential to full inclusion in community life. And housing and transportation. And we deliberately kept those connected, and Alan talked about that, I gather, earlier, and we saw those two as inextricably linked. And as we've done the work, it's been really neat to see what we've learned. Council has already started to act on. So we are already taking steps to implement a low-income transit pass, even though our task force hasn't even completed its work yet, because there's this building consensus and public conversation and buy-in from our council. And so that's very, very encouraging, and it is having a transformational effect. So all of these 7 areas connect in some way to the social determinants of health. And again, that link to not only saving money on healthcare, that's the fiscal answer for it, but having a healthier community is going to mean more vibrant participation. It's going to mean vibrant communities. So, but social determinants of health has been one of our lenses for this work. And so our recommendations are under development right now. We're slaving over 400 individual tactical actions under 70 different headings, and they all roll up to these pillars that we talked about. And we're going to be reporting to City Council in the fall on our final advice to Council, which is going to include not only things for the city to do and not only advocacy to other orders of government, as we've talked about the importance for that, but also initiatives that we can undertake in collaboration with the community. And again, if we can apply to the $50 million fund, that'd be awesome. So I think one of the most transformational learnings to date, though, has been about the connection of the lived experience of people in poverty to trauma, to historical trauma in particular. And we've seen that initially through the lens of the situation Indigenous people in our community find themselves in. And we learned a lot about this when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Edmonton for their 7th and final event last spring. And it was a transformational experience for our community. And we had decision makers and leaders and people from across sectors attend this, and it really opened their eyes. And when the captain of the Edmonton Oilers took his family, all of a sudden a whole new group of people was paying attention. And so it was very, very broad and very, very inspiring for us. And it led to a year of reconciliation in our city and many initiatives to reach out and restore relationships with Indigenous peoples and with their communities and their home settlements and First Nations. And I won't tell you about all of the things that we've done, but we're very proud of the work that we've started. But what we learned as we closed in on the end of the year of reconciliation was that a year's not going to cut it. This is really, and Wab Canoe, who's a fellow honorary witness of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he and I were at an event last fall, and he said, we're living lifetimes of reconciliation. And that's why this work is going to take a generation, particularly with Indigenous communities. But we have sought to reach out and understand the lived experience of Indigenous people, and you may or may not know that the highest concentration of residential schools in this country was in Alberta, and the highest concentration of survivors lives in my city. And also, as the population, the 2nd largest urban Aboriginal population in the country if you look at the city itself, and the largest if you draw a 100-kilometer radius. It's bigger than Winnipeg when you include the sort of in our extended metro catchment, the First Nations communities and individuals who live there. And so there are probably more intergenerational survivors in our community than anywhere else in the country when you draw that circle big. And I don't want to single us out versus Winnipeg. We're working very closely with Winnipeg, very closely with Saskatoon, very closely with Regina. And due respect, if you're not from the prairies, you may not understand the scale of the challenge or the opportunity. Reconciliation is the neatest thing to come along in nation building that I have ever seen. This is a phenomenal opportunity for us to wrong 4 or 5 or 6 generations of deep colonial error. And it may take many generations to get there, but the opportunity to really bring to life the treaty spirit. And Bob Ray talks about this very, very eloquently if you ever get a chance to hear him talk about it. He said the way the federal government argues about the treaties, and they spend a lot more money in court than they do on educating kids, and they should flip that and equalize funding for First Nations children's education on reserve rather than spend money fighting about not doing it. And Cindy Blackstock's been a phenomenal champion of this. But he says, and I think it's an amazing metaphor, that the federal government, and this goes back to the people who signed the treaty on behalf of the settlers in the name of the Crown, that they thought it was a divorce. Said, this is ours, that's yours, now we go our separate ways. But Indigenous people, in their oral tradition, saw it as a marriage, a coming together. We will share this together in perpetuity. You know, till death do us part, except it's not about death, it's an intergenerational pact. As long as the rivers flow, as long as the grass grows, as long as the sky is blue. So isn't it sad that as settlers and as bystanders to an argument where we're trying to get divorced from the people who have extraordinary potential to reshape this country, the youngest and fastest growing segment of the population in this country, a surging group of young people with extraordinary energy. And if you haven't read John Ralston Saul's book around this, it's inspiring. And if you haven't met these leaders, they're the truly inspiring people. And they demand change. They want life to be better in their communities, whether they live in the city or whether they're going back to their First Nation to make change in their own community. And so I think that's one of the greatest nation building opportunities we have, to support innovative economic development, to make sure that there's housing and transportation and inclusion and education, at least at a level playing field. And we probably have to go beyond that to restore the historical inequities that have existed for generation after generation. And if we do that, that's how we're going to start to deal with the fact that if you're Aboriginal in Edmonton, you are 10 times as likely to be homeless than a non-Indigenous person. If you're an Indigenous family, you're twice as likely to live in poverty. We see this overrepresentation in the statistics and in the poverty profile that we did. And it's why, if you're an Aboriginal woman, you are 4 times more likely to go missing or get murdered. And that's unjust. It's absolutely unjust. But reconciliation is about dealing with inclusion, about the uplifting of all people, including the people we married a couple hundred years ago. There was no divorce. And so, as you can see, we've become quite passionate about this. I've personally become quite passionate about this. And some of the same barriers, and we've learned how much people have in common, are faced by immigrants and refugees, faced by women, faced by persons with disabilities, and we've struggled and we've worked hard to make sure that we apply each one of those lenses to our work. Now, I mentioned Edmonton's ready for this, and I said I'd give you some numbers on this. We did a survey, and we found 94% of Edmontonians agree that eliminating poverty will benefit society in general. I don't know what the other 6% are thinking, but that was still reassuring. 87% agree that ending poverty is the right thing to do. That's an extraordinary consensus on an extremely complex and, in the short term, costly thing to take leadership on. And here's the really great part. 87% of Edmontonians agree that poverty can be eliminated or drastically reduced. They think this is doable. I didn't know that when I stood up a year ago at the first state of the city after I was elected, and in front of the Chamber of Commerce of the City of Edmonton said, I'm putting a marker down on this, I'm striking a task force, I'm going to bring the weight of my office to this. And there was a moment of tiny silence, and then a huge roar of applause. And I felt immediate relief. And this is attributable to the fact that I'm just doing my part in a timeline. There are people before me, some of whom are in the room, people like Mark who've been doing this work since before I was born. And I didn't mean him specifically, I just meant in general. I mean, I respect my elders. They have real wisdom. They really, no, honestly, they do. But the United Way has been championing this cause in our city for a long, long time. The language they use, and they use it, and people in the businesses that raise money and the organizations that raise money, they say, poverty is solvable. And somebody built a giant Rubik's Cube and said poverty is solvable on it, and it was part of the University of Alberta's United Way campaign, and you can actually move it. So it's really interactive, and everyone's getting their pictures taken with it, and it's cool. Poverty is solvable. We can do this. It's inspirational. And then people like my wife, who doesn't get paid to do the work that she does as first person of the city of Edmonton, but she's working in schools because those are the set of leaders who are going to have to carry this work forward. So she's talking to leadership classes and elementary school kids and anyone who will listen about the importance of this work and the importance of not judging people because of the circumstances they happen to be in today. And the kids already get it. She's just reinforcing the message, and she's building an army the likes of which you cannot comprehend. And she's going to be the next year's chair for the United Way campaign. So it's all hands on deck at the Iveson household to end poverty in Edmonton. But it is a networked approach. People are working across sectors. Again, we have this phenomenal group of people who are beginning to buy into this, because really what we're trying to do is build a movement. That's how we've seen it, and that's why we wound up with End Poverty Edmonton. It's just a simple imperative, and you're either in or you're not. And from the survey work that we did, we found out most Edmontonians are notionally there already. We just need to get them to buy in and take action. And we needed other partners to start to buy in and take action as well. And the provincial government, actually, the previous provincial government, I have to give credit where credit was due, for many, many years wouldn't even use the word poverty. But then in the last few years, partly after we've started to make this progress with them on ending homelessness, they started talking about poverty. They started talking about eliminating child poverty and significantly reducing poverty among adults. And that was part of a social policy framework that's actually some really, really progressive policy. And again, Alberta defying your expectations and stereotypes potentially. And with it, within it is a poverty reduction plan and poverty elimination plan for children that we expect is either going to go ahead or go ahead even faster now after last night's work. But we had great partnership with the province of Alberta coming along to this consensus, and a great sense that this was possible. And so many partners will make this happen, but I do want to, just before I close, emphasize that this is going to require not only partnerships with the provincial government on all of the areas of jurisdiction you'd expect. It is going to require partnership with the federal government around housing, in the short term around these expiring funding agreements, which put housing that our most vulnerable Canadians rely on at risk. And it also requires some more work with our federal government about their urban Aboriginal strategy for reasons that I talked about previously. It also requires work with our school boards, because there's phenomenal opportunities around childcare and around after-school programming that we can co-create with our schools and activate schools as community hubs. And it also involves working with other governments, specifically First Nations, the Treaty Confederations, and Métis settlements, who we can co-create a better future for their members as they live in our city together. And so there's going to be a lot of government collaboration as well. But ultimately, as we consolidate our work and as we work to tie it all together, it really is Edmontonians who are going to have to deliver this. And I think that's the strength of taking a bottom-up approach. And I really do think cities are going to continue to drive change in this country, whether it's urban transit policy or whether it's poverty elimination. We have that role to play for the reasons I talked about, which is that we're a little bit outside the partisan fray. We can call for solutions. We can be evidence-based. In a much more clear-cut way, I think, than other orders of government, simply because of structure and scale. and we have that connection with our population because we're closest to the people. And we've shown real results in things like eliminating homelessness and the work we've done. And we've shown remarkable alignment in terms of City of Edmonton, City of Calgary, City of Medicine Hat, City of Lethbridge, City of Red Deer, communities all across Alberta developing these strategies and doubling down with political leadership and civic buy-in from across sectors to really move the needle on this. And so cities are on the front lines when it comes to galvanizing innovative approaches, to engaging citizens to be part of this work, and to ensuring our communities take care of our most vulnerable. And so I told a story in last week's State of the City about a giant flood that hit Edmonton in 1915. And the same things would have happened in Calgary a few years ago, but I was reminding Edmontonians of some history. And part of the metaphor was, the water went up 42 feet in the river in Edmonton, washed out businesses, 2,000 people were homeless. Do you think people stood on the riverbank and argued about whose jurisdiction it was to fix the problem? No, Edmontonians, like any other community-minded people, rolled up their sleeves and got to work. And that's what's happening in communities and with local governments across this country, that's creating space where there's comfort for provincial governments to come in and eventually federal governments to come in and do this work with us. So let me leave you with a quote then that we stumbled across from one of the US strategies. I can't remember which city, I have to look this up, but this really resonated with me. Charity is good, justice is better. And so surely, this is justice that we can all get behind, and I'm thrilled to be able to tell you that Edmonton is ready. Thank you.